It's the Russian way of war. Death is to be expected, often on a massive scale. But in the end, the attritional strategy pays dividends and the enemy collapses. That time-tested strategy has been employed by Vladimir Putin ever since he invaded Ukraine. But it's not working. Putin's strategy to outlast Ukraine has blown up in his face, and his last hope that the West would abandon Ukraine has disappeared. There are two sides to this story: what Putin was hoping for and what is actually happening to Russia right now. Throw a wild card into the mix and a plan that once seemed so certain in Putin's mind has crumbled. We'll come to the wild card and what's really happening soon. First, there's what Putin hoped for. In a January 16th interview with the Times Radio's The Trump Report, the founder of the Magnitsky Justice Campaign, Bill Browder, laid it all out. And so what Putin is hoping for is that even though he's suffering unbelievable casualties, and we're talking about 1,000 Russian soldiers are being killed every day, but what he's hoping for is that we're going to tire before he does, Browder says. The we in his statement is the collective West, and Browder is suggesting that Putin believes that his winning strategy is no longer to attrit the Ukrainian forces on the battlefield, it's simply to keep pushing, projecting false power all the way, until the West withdraws the support that he feels is key to Ukraine's survival. Browder continues, adding, "And even if we only experience 1/100th of the pain in our democracies and our free media, and so on, we're all, tying ourselves up in knots and knots saying, well, should we be carrying on supporting Ukraine?" That is Putin's big gamble, in that the seemingly never-ending flow of Russian forces into Ukraine will eventually lead to Ukraine's allies throwing in the towel. It's resources versus willpower. Putin is betting that the latter will fail for the West before the former fails for Russia. Not that Putin isn't hedging his bets a little. As he grows more desperate to see his strategy through to the end, Russia's president has been making some token claims that he hopes will appease Ukraine's European allies. For instance, December 2025 saw Putin claim that any thought that Russia would attack another European country is nonsense. All that those countries have to do, Putin said during a 4.5-hour televised address, is to respect Russia. There won't be any operations if you treat us with respect, if you respect our interests just as we've always tried to respect yours, Putin said when answering a question from the BBC about his so-called special military operation. Respect, in this case, means let us do what we want in Ukraine and we won't have any trouble. Putin doesn't seem to realize that what Russia is doing in Ukraine is the very reason why the collective West has been so steadfast in its support for the nation so far. You could take these words as an attempt to schmooze those in Europe who might argue that the Ukraine war has dragged on too long and that it's draining their country's resources. Again, that's what Putin hopes, and he has reason to believe that his strategy could work. To some, the West's collective response to Putin's Ukraine invasion was underwhelming from the off, and it's only now approaching the levels that it should have been 4 years ago. One of the people who shares that opinion is Bohdan Nihilo, who wrote a piece for the Kyiv Post on January 17th, in which he argued that delays in appeasement are the reason for why Russia has been able to launch a winter campaign of airstrikes that have left thousands of Ukrainians without electricity and heating. Nihilo brings up air defenses, which Ukraine has pleaded many times over the years. These requests were met with hesitation, delays, and political concerns about escalation. Western leaders, especially in Washington, worried about provoking Moscow and appearing too involved. They sent javelins and HIMARS, which helped but could not stop the constant attacks from Russian missiles and drones launched from afar, Nihilo argues. He may have a point. To Putin, the fact that the West, particularly the US, was so hesitant to risk escalation of the war means that he may still have an in. Just keep it up, is Putin's current mantra. The West will stay scared and it will eventually relent, and when it does, Ukraine will be there for the taking. Of course, the threats, cajoling, and even the attempts at soothing the very fears that Putin created all serve an ulterior motive. We see that in Putin's approach to peace talks. In November, the Atlantic Council noted that for all of his talk of a supposed peace, Putin has done nothing but escalate his efforts to erase Ukraine. The outlet highlights what Russia has been doing in the occupied regions of Ukraine, where it claims that a reign of terror is in place against the civilians in Ukraine's south and east. Ukrainian symbols of statehood, heritage, and culture are being erased and replaced with a campaign of Russification of a state that escaped the former Soviet yoke over 3 decades ago. Putin doesn't want peace. He wants Europe to go back to the way it was when he prowled the halls of the KGB. That means any claims that he will stop at Ukraine have to be taken with a grain of salt so big that it would cause your blood pressure to skyrocket. The strategy now is the same as it's always been: outlast the enemy. Only the new twist is that Putin seems to increasingly see the West, and Europe in particular, as the enemy he needs to outlast rather than Ukraine. The West throwing in the towel is Putin's dream scenario. There's also a chance, no matter how small, that the wildcard we'll get to later in the video could help him make that dream a reality. However, what we're seeing in most of the West is that Putin's plan has crumbled. Apart from backing away from supporting Ukraine, many of Ukraine's strongest allies are only taking more steps to reinforce their support. This is what we've seen from January 2026 alone. On January 16th, Ukraine and the UK marked the first anniversary of their historic 100-year partnership, which was put in place to send a clear message to Putin that the UK will support Ukraine's sovereignty for long after Russia's president is gone. A pledge of £20 million, or about $26.99 million, was made to help support Ukraine's flagging energy security on the same date, making this at least one seemingly rock-solid partnership with which Putin can't meddle. Just 10 days before that anniversary, the Paris Declaration was revealed. This declaration is essentially an agreement between the UK, the US, and the Coalition of the Willing, which is being spearheaded by the UK and France, to provide strong security guarantees for Ukraine once the war ends. In addition to pledging a multinational force backed by a proposed US-led ceasefire verification and monitoring mechanism, the declaration also saw the coalition declare its continued support for Ukraine's armed forces and claim it would make binding commitments in terms of how it would respond in the event of a future Russian invasion. Again, the message was sent. The West is actively working toward a future where Ukraine exists, which is the opposite of what Putin's strategy is supposed to achieve. There have also been more tangible examples that the West isn't willing to let Putin have everything his own way. January has seen Ukraine's allies seize 3 of Russia's Shadow Fleet vessels. The first 2 of those seizures occurred during the first week of the year as US forces boarded and detained both the Marinera and MT Sofia. These ships had links to Venezuela, where the US recently completed an operation to capture the now former dictatorial president Nicolas Maduro. More recently, France, with a helping hand from the UK, seized another Shadow Fleet vessel in the Mediterranean. The Grinch, which feels like such an apt name for a Russian ship, was boarded, examined, and then taken for further examination. Declarations and partnerships act as the paper proof that the West still supports Ukraine. The seizing of oil tankers is much more of a physical reminder of the fact that this support is strong in the present as well as hypothetically strong in the future. Ukraine will hope that these kinds of Shadow Fleet seizures will continue and perhaps even escalate. Browder says whether they will or not is dependent on what Trump is saying to the likes of French President Emmanuel Macron and the UK's Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer. In one sense, by him, Trump, going after the Venezuelan Shadow Fleet, which happens to also overlap with the Russian Shadow Fleet, Putin again, he's being humiliated, Browder declares. On the other hand, we don't hear any announcements of Trump taking over and boarding Shadow Fleet boats belonging to Russia that have nothing to do with Venezuela, he adds. The US Shadow Fleet support may well be conditional on whether it benefits the United States and its current policies or not. Putin will look at all of these examples of the support that he wishes to erode that have occurred in just over 3 weeks of the new year and see that his grand strategy isn't working out the way he wanted. Remember, this strategy is all about attrition, Russian resources versus Western willpower, as we said earlier. The Western willpower seems to still be strong, but what will really be hurting Putin, and what he may never have expected, is that a strategy that focused on Russian resource strength has ignored the impact the Ukraine war is having on Russia's people. That impact is pronounced, damaging, and it's sending Russia closer to the abyss with each passing day. Let's start with Ukraine's own contributions to the attempted shutdown of the Shadow Fleet. Now, there is one person who is dealing with the Shadow Fleet in his own special way, and that's Volodymyr Zelensky, Browder says, before adding, and he is systematically immobilizing these ships as they sail into the Black Sea, and sometimes doing it outside of the Black Sea. Indeed, Ukraine's own campaign against the Shadow Fleet seems to have been more effective than that of its allies so far. Toward the end of November, Ukrainian strike drones targeted a pair of Russian oil tankers that were attempting to sail through the Black Sea. Several months before that, the Kyiv Post reported that Ukraine had conducted a series of about half a dozen surgical strikes against Black Sea vessels, with many of those strikes taking place in international waters or ports. There have been other attacks since, but Ukraine has shown that it's more than capable of doing what its allies won't or can't with these strikes. Again, it's attrition. A Shadow Fleet ship that can't sail is a ship that Russia can't use to sell its oil. Speaking of oil, Ukraine has also been attacking the Shadow Fleet indirectly by targeting Russian oil facilities en masse. 2025 saw Ukraine massively accelerate the campaign of long-range strikes against Russia's oil refineries and infrastructure. The effects of this campaign were remarkable. In November, the Bloomsbury Intelligence and Security Institute, or BISI, noted that about 55% of Russia's refineries had been targeted by Ukraine since its first strike against a refinery in June 2022. However, 2025 was the banner year so far. Ukraine managed to shut down around 20% of Russia's refining capacity, and it carried out 48% more successful strikes against refineries in that year than it did in 2024, BISI claims. There's a pretty simple logic behind this strategy. BISI points out that about 30% of Russia's annual budget comes from its oil and gas sales. Right now, that budget contribution is being propped up by the Shadow Fleet. So the logic goes that Ukraine and its Western allies take out Shadow Fleet vessels by strikes or seizures, while Ukraine also attacks the product that those vessels are transporting, leading to other vessels in the Shadow Fleet becoming useless by default. An extra layer added to these refinery strikes is that Ukraine has also been hitting crude oil storage facilities and, in the case of its January strikes in the Caspian Sea, Russian oil drilling rigs. These attacks have led to Russia's supply of crude oil to its refineries being the lowest that it's been for 15 years, per a January 20th article by oilprice.com. Crude processing rates also declined by 1.7% in 2025 compared to the previous year, which is a natural outcome of less crude oil being available. Russia claims unscheduled maintenance as the reason behind these declines. That's a nice way of saying, our crude oil facilities are burning because of Ukraine. If you're starting to wonder how all of these oil issues link back to Putin's strategy of causing Western support for Ukraine to diminish, it's all about Ukraine showcasing that it has the will to fight. Willpower, again, is Putin's undoing. What he's trying to frame as a hopeless battle for Ukraine in the collective Western mind is actually a war that is costing Russia so dearly that it's clear that with continued support, it will end up being Ukraine that outlasts Russia. Furthermore, what's happening to Russian oil is an example of Putin slowly losing one of the resources he needs for his attritional strategy to work out. Oil is far from the only resource that he's losing. As Browder notes, the sheer scale of death that Russia's military has seen inflicted upon its own is an example of yet another resource being drained. Putin has sent, according to Ukrainian statistics, somewhere around 1.2 million young men who have either been killed or permanently disabled through this war, Browder says. That's a lot of people. I mean, that's an unimaginable amount of people, he adds. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance backs this number and even says that it has risen to above 1.23 million since Browder's interview. Privately, Browder suggests many people in Russia must be thinking that the rampant death being inflicted on their countrymen has to stop, if only to ensure that there will be any Russians left after the end of Putin's war. Those same people are also being forced to deal with the impact of the brutality to which Russia's soldiers are exposed. The Russian military cycles soldiers in and out of Ukraine, and it also has soldiers working under contracts that allow them to return home if they make it through their stints in Ukraine alive. Throw a bunch of men who've been exposed to the worst that humanity has to offer, often by their own commanders and comrades, and you get a situation where violent crime is on the rise in Russia. Browder suggests that this should be expected. Russia's returning soldiers have been trained, albeit often poorly, to kill and maim Ukrainians. They've also seen many of their friends and comrades destroyed on the battlefield. All of a sudden, these psychologically damaged people are, when they're done, if they're not killed in action, are then coming back and doing the same thing in Russia, Browder says. Look past the hyperbole and you see that Browder has a point. A December 2025 report in the Moscow Times says that returning Russian soldiers have been linked to over 1,000 killings and injuries during the 4 years that the Ukraine war has raged. Bear in mind that this statistic relates to the small number of soldiers who have returned so far. If the war were to end tomorrow, approximately 695,000 soldiers would come streaming back into the country. A percentage of those soldiers will bring their brutality back home. Ironically, this would lead to yet more manpower, which Putin considers a resource, being lost to death and injury on Russian soil. And despite all that Putin has spent and outright lost on his supposed special military operation, Ukraine still stands, as does the support of its allies. With his strategy collapsing around him, the only slight hope that Putin has left of outlasting Ukraine is the wild card that we mentioned at the start of the video. You may have already guessed what that wild card is: the United States, or more specifically, the Trump administration. Browder highlights the often contradictory nature of the US approach to Russia under Trump. On the one hand, he points to the US actions in Venezuela as a sign that the Trump administration isn't afraid to ruffle Putin's feathers if Russia is standing in the way of something the US wants. The American military operation to take Maduro was a spectacular success militarily for the Americans to be able to go in, completely immobilize all of their defenses, grab the dictator, the illegitimate dictator of a rogue regime, take him out, and not lose a single American life. That's the type of power that Putin wants, but 4 years of warfare have proven that he simply doesn't have it. So message sent, right? Not necessarily. On the other hand, Browder cites Trump's claims that the US should be granted control over Greenland. That's ammunition for Putin, Browder claims. If America wants to take Greenland, why is anyone giving us a hard time about Crimea or Ukraine? Browder says could easily become Putin's argument. It's unlikely that Trump intends to give Putin this sort of ammunition, as his focus appears to be on strengthening the US with his play for Greenland. Still, the elements of hypocrisy are there. Furthermore, the support that the Trump administration shows for Ukraine, such as the Shadow Fleet ship seizures, is often counterbalanced by Trump saying things that suggest he wants to keep Ukraine guessing. In mid-January, Trump pointed the finger squarely at Zelensky as the reason why a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia hadn't been reached. The Kremlin reacted quickly, with Putin's favorite mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, saying, "Here we can agree, it's really the case." Peskov speaks with Putin's words, so Russia's president may still have a glimmer of hope that his willpower versus resources strategy could work out for him in the end. But then there's always the problem with wildcards. You never know what they're going to do next. As long as the rest of the West, especially Ukraine's European allies, stand firm, the wildcard factor can be mitigated and Putin's final play for victory will fall short. After all, Putin is already in his endgame, even if he doesn't realize it yet. With his geopolitical influence collapsing, a raft of economic issues hurting Russia, and all of the issues we've just discussed lumped on top, Putin has put himself in a no-win situation, where only escalation without the hope of victory remains. Find out what all of that means in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to The Military Show for more insight into what's going on behind the Ukrainian battlefield. And thank you, as always, for watching.